Welcome everybody to the third webinar of 2023 of the International Corporate Governance Society here. It's our absolute pleasure to have Randall Peterson here today. Before we start, I would like to remind you that you can use the chat, and it would be lovely if you try out the chat already and let us know from where you're joining to post questions. So you can use the chat to post questions, but you can also use the Q&A function. And we actually prefer if you use the Q&A function for questions that you might have to Randall. Ruth and I, we will monitor the Q&A, and then at the end of the webinar, so it's the last 20-25-ish minutes, we will post and pick a few of the questions that you post on the Q&A section. So please do use the chat, please do use the Q&A section. At the end of the webinar, you will be able to hear the answers to your question that Ruth and I will post. So welcome everybody again. My name is George Wernicke. I'm an assistant professor at HEC Paris, and it's my absolute pleasure here on behalf of the International Corporate Governance Society to introduce and welcome Randall Peterson here today. He is a professor of organizational behavior at London Business School, where he also is the academic director of the Leadership Institute. Before joining LBS in what was it, 2004, you were a professor at Cornell, and your background is in social psychology. That's where you have your PhD from Northwestern University. Randall obviously does not need an introduction at all. He's one of the leading scholars in the field of organizational behavior, especially when it comes to teams and top management teams and how they interact with one another. But Randall is not here to talk about this rich reservoir of research specifically, but about a book he has recently published together with Gary Brown. The book is called Disaster in the Boardroom. It's a fantastic read. I've read it. It's extremely useful. It's based on academic research, but written for more a general audience. And it's really one of the exemplary pieces of publications where academic research informs practice and practitioners. So it's a fantastic book, Disaster in the Boardroom. Randall, you're going to talk about the book. At the end, we will have 20 to 25 minutes to pose questions, to ask some questions. And I'm going to shut up here and I'm going to hand over to you, Randall. Thanks for being here today, and take it away. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. A real pleasure to be here. And as you said, this is a book that is informed very fundamentally by academic research, but is designed for a much broader audience. I work quite a lot these days with directors in big companies doing various types of things I'll talk about at the end. And we really wanted to be able to speak to that audience as much as to other audiences that we oftentimes speak to. So let me share the slides. Hopefully everybody can see that. I've got just a short presentation, and then we'll open up for questions, and just giving you a kind of overview of the book and the kind of things that are there and how I've approached it. So this backstory to this book is Jerry Brown is a private equity guy, and he has been interested in boards and good corporate governance for a long time from a practitioner point of view. He actually gave us a lot of money for our Leadership Institute, and really wanted us to start to focus more on corporate governance, which we have done. And he came to me literally with this big trunk of 30 years of newspaper clippings of board disasters, and said, Randall, we need to be able to do something with this. Like, what can we do with this? We need to talk about it, and what can the world do to stop this stuff from happening? And so I kind of like, okay, well, it was a jumble of stuff from all over the world. And so I went back to the stuff I know, right, and said, okay, first of all, we'll focus on those that are board of directors of companies, and maybe to some degree, we could look at, say, some of the big charities. What we're not going to do is look at the top management team. Some people call those boards sometimes these days. I've always been interested from day one in top team and board. But to me, those are the better language than people these days using things like management board. Anyway, it's not about that. It's obviously not about private equity type of private boards. They have a very different background. And so this was the book was published in February 2022, and this is the very first review that was posted by somebody that neither one of Jerry or I know. And actually, it was like exactly the review we were hoping for. The publishers initially said not, the first couple of publishers said no to the book not because he didn't like the book, but because he said nobody buys them. Books don't sell. Books on corporate governance don't sell much. And so we said, but this is written for a broader audience, and we got to this publisher who was willing to take a chance on it. I'm happy to say they've been thrilled with it because it's sold way better than any of the other corporate governance books they've used, because it was written for a broader audience. So the book is about boardroom disasters, and it covers 300 years, going back to, I mean, we talked about tulip mania and the South Seas bubble, kind of very early corporate governance failures, right up to today, from all over the world. And a couple things we note in here. One, a lot of people normalize failure as part of, what was obviously greater wealth creation out there in the world. And we're not talking about the normal, though, ups and downs of companies that come and go over time. What we're talking about is really the big disasters where the cost is massive, the decision was obviously bad, and how do boards make those kind of decisions? It's not for lack of, raw talent in the room. It's not for lack usually of even information. And this is actually, I think, one of the kind of most shocking things in the book is that almost every time, if you look carefully, somebody in the room knew what was going on and either could not be heard, or the board, I don't want to know, or they just couldn't be heard from a perspective of, they may even said something, but nobody else took it seriously. So it's not about lack of information typically even. It is a cultural problem, is the kind of observation that we make. And so what is it about board cultures that makes it difficult for them to not make these kind of disastrous decisions that we're talking about, the kind that kill people, that destroy the environment, that, and so on. And this is actually where the work from my end was really about. And it's kind of too big to really talk much about here, but I wanted to lay it out. It's in the book. And what you'll see is 6 basic dysfunctions. Each one is associated with a particular theory. So what I did is to say, look, this is mess of disasters here. Are there theories out there in the research that would help us understand in each case a big chunk of these disasters? And looking across like what theories are actually useful here. And most of the time, those theories give us a kind of core problem. What they don't always do is and they kind of indirectly, oftentimes they tell us what a good board should look like, and less directly what a good director should look like. So so there's at the left-hand side here, this is all what the theories tell us. On the right side, there's some speculation based on my understanding of those theories. And you'll see I'm drawing on obviously agency theory and corporate governance, but resource dependence theory, some sense making, upper echelons theory, and some group dynamics, including groupthink. And I thought that it explained most of what was going on here. So let me just give you the kind of what we've done. So, we look at each theory. What does an effective director look like, right? What are they doing? And, resource dependence frame, sense-making frame, why are boards helpful here again, upper echelons theory, and then some groupthink theory. So this is the kind of, when I teach it, this is the kind of, I don't usually show that big graph or the big table. I use this as a way of helping directors and people interested in corporate governance, and my MBA elective or executive MBA elective understand what that should look like. And so these are the 6 dysfunctions, and I want to just briefly touch on each one of the 6, give you an example that we use from the book, and then talk a little bit about how the solutions that we put forward for some of these problems. So the first one is what I call the distended board, cultural amplification. So a culture that's helpful in time 1 becomes overemphasized and grows kind of out of control. And we feel that the kind of what I think is the poster child for this was Uber. I'm sure pretty much everybody in this call is familiar with the kind of absolute toxic culture that Uber has become. They're trying hard to pull it back now. But of course, early on in Uber's history, being aggressive, being pretty cutthroat was what it took to get Uber into all the markets where established taxi firms were resisting them. But of course, take the idea of being, a bit cutthroat and pretty aggressive and turn it on your own employees, and you have, just gets out of control, and it turns into what Uber became. And so in the book, we also give you, say, a set of questions to ask to diagnose each one of these. So in this particular case, one of the questions, for example, is, do you have to justify your culture if you had to explain it to your family? I know that sounds really terrible, but actually it's not really that bad. Okay. That's a good signal that the culture really is out of control. You live in it, you may justify it, but if it doesn't make sense to an outsider, it probably is not a great culture, probably extreme, and causing some problems. So first one is this distended board. The second one is what I call the bystander board, where everybody looks around and says, must be somebody else's problem. Please let it be somebody else's problem here. And the example we use here is BP, and particularly the Deepwater Horizons event, where probably most of you will remember pumping lots of oil into the Gulf of Mexico and hitting the news all over the world. And from day one, the news said it was a BP rig. In actual fact, it was not owned by BP. It was owned by someone else who was under contract to deliver this for BP. And so for 7 days, the BP board hoped that the news would pick up on the other company and not them. And after 7 days, they finally realized that that was not going to happen, that their name was being dragged through the mud. And they finally got onto it and had to really dig, obviously a deep hole to dig out of. But in those 7 days, of course, it was just unmitigated disaster out there in terms of the BP name. Now, in this case, once they got onto it, they did a halfway decent job of it, but they just waited and waited too long, hoping that this responsibility would be picked up elsewhere. And by the way, in most of these cases, we've got somebody who was in the boardroom at the time. That's why we pick these cases. We are, through our connections, we were able to get to, and it could be different, it could be one of the directors, sometimes a chair, and sometimes a company secretary. And because we're really wanting to make sure that these specific examples we get, we know exactly what was going on in there. The imbalance board, one where there's a lack of diversity. And though because those voices aren't in the room, important things just aren't said. And in this case, now Alphabet, of course, but Google, you remember that paper that was floating around about how women are not capable in tech, that those gender differences are the explanation why tech is so heavily male rather than female. If you look at senior management in the board, particularly the board, there were no women, right? So nobody in those, no women in the senior positions, able to stand there and say, this is going to blow out. This is going to be bad. And it may seem shocking that it's that simple. And there's obviously more to it than that. But that was a key problem, that they just didn't have, important voices in the room at the time. What I call the conforming boards, or what we call the conforming board, this is groupthink. Everybody may have private doubts, but in fact, nobody says anything and therefore nothing happens. So in this case, we use the Royal Bank of Scotland, the acquisition specifically of ABN AMRO. Again, many of you may know this one. At the time, it was the largest bank acquisition in the history of the world. And it was passed through the board with a 10-minute perfunctory conversation. And you might think, say, the side conversations or the pre-conversations meant that a lot of this stuff, a lot of the issues around this acquisition may have been discussed and debated. But you know what? Not really. What was happening is Fred Goodwin, strong leader, if you know groupthink theory, having a very clear point of view and everybody else kind of falling in line behind them. Behind him, he had had a series of acquisitions, each one successful. So when he proposed this one, and basically he didn't tolerate, if you question him, he'd find ways to make your life difficult. So people didn't question him. And it's turned into kind of everybody just looking around and saying yes. How you can make that kind of decision in 10 minutes in a boardroom, shocking. What I'm calling the bureaucratic boards, those that focus on the rules rather than the spirit behind the rules. And if you follow the rules, everything will be fine. And a lot of basic groups theory talks about things like this. And I'm using as an example here each of the big four. They're all heavily group focused or rule focused, sorry, and they all have their own greater or lesser scandals associated with following the letter of the law and the rules, but not actually following the spirit of them. And then lastly, this is a classic subordinated board agency problem. Management is not independent from the board. Board is not independent from management. So basically you do whatever management wants. So you're not really, obviously, haven't solved the principal agent problem. Facebook, obviously now Meta, they're changing their name, trying to, but Mark Zuckerberg, of course, and a number of the big Silicon Valley tech firms have done this. They've gone public. The majority of shares are owned outside, but the majority of voting shares are still owned, in this case, by Mark Zuckerberg. So Mark is to do whatever Mark wants to do, even though it's a big listed company. There is no independence of the board from management. And so when these things happen, obviously management, if they don't want to do something, or if they want to do something that's not great for anybody other than management, they can get away with it. So those were the 6 causes that we derived from research. Some of the solutions we talk about. What about the quality of independent directioners? At this point, no major jurisdiction has any selection criteria other than you can't have been convicted by a felony. Or what about ongoing education? Point who you want, but have some form. Most every profession in the world has some kind of ongoing education requirement. Lawyers, doctors, teachers, etc. There's nothing here. And it doesn't have to be onerous. It can be fairly straightforward. Even if it's just finding out what the latest issues are, right? Increasingly, most jurisdictions are encouraging boards to do things like board assessments. So say in the UK, they're required to have an external assessment every 3 years. Most of those assessments, though, function on basically, do you follow the law, tick, 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 and don't focus very much on what the regulator actually wants you to focus on, which is what is our culture, how do we work together, are we interacting in a way that's likely to bring out the best decision making. Now, a good board review will do that, and there are a number of providers out there that do, but there are way too many that avoid this by just focusing on some very, very narrow criteria. So can we improve the board evaluation process? In most places, anybody can hang a shingle and say, I do board evaluations. Again, with no certification in the background, no quality control. And, I hear stories regularly in the US and in the UK where boards are being charged $100,000, $150,000 for a board evaluation that is very narrow in scope, and doesn't actually address some of the key issues that we find in this book, and that, some of the and key culture issues. Again, I just find this shocking. I think is the only word I can use. Getting into it. We all know that regulators don't always enforce the rules terribly rigorously in white-collar crime area. Now, some places are starting to a little bit, but even if they just rigorously enforce the existing rules would be helpful with real penalties. The other thing that we really think has important, and it's actually starting to happen now in the last few years since we wrote the book, and that is investors looking at, they oftentimes look at the top team, they look at finance. What they don't often look at historically is the governance of the organization. And now the investors I'm interacting with are telling me that's starting to change. But that's a long way to run. If investors demanded better governance, better board evaluations, we all know it would happen. They are the ones with the real power, even more so than regulators in many ways. And so I'm really pleased that many of the big players, investors, are starting to really look at governance as something that is measurable and has a direct impact on the quality of what happens in the organization. Now, in addition to all of that, so I've been talking about the book, but I have tended to, in the last 5 years or so, done a lot of stuff that is kind of on the academic practitioner border. So some stuff in the Harvard Business Review, stuff for what was called the ICSA, the Institute of Corporate Secretaries and Administrators. It's now the Center for Corporate Governance in the UK. And then the last one on the bottom, looking at the impact of board diversity in the FTSE 350, done as a piece of research commissioned by the FRC, the regulator in the UK. And obviously when I got in, because the FRC name means most boards will talk to you. So, I spoke to probably 125 directors in FTSE 350 companies. And in the process, when I got in, we collected lots of other data that I'm hoping that we're going to be able to publish here in academic journals. But the background to that one is if you actually get into that one, it's very much a kind of scholarly take. And the regulator picked us specifically for it. And I think we were able to deliver some pretty important messages to the regulator about things like just even basic stuff, like when every time they talk about diversity, all the boards say, yes, we're talking about diversity, we're interested in it. But in practice, they're actually talking about different things. Boards are talking about diversity of perspective, which might have something to do with the demographics or it might not. And the regulator's talking about demographic diversity. So this first thing out of the gate for them was, you're banging on about this, but you're not specific enough, and boards are not hearing what you think they're hearing. So lots more in all of that, if anybody's interested. Obviously, if you want to know more about it, I've got lots of stuff on my personal website. And I've been particularly focused on social media on corporate governance issues in the last couple of years. So like on Twitter and LinkedIn, it's not just my own stuff. If I find anything that I think is good out there, I've been tweeting it and posting it on LinkedIn as well. I'm really trying to raise the awareness of the practitioners that I interact with about what we as scholars have to say in the corporate governance space that is helpful, because corporate governance is really on the radar screen right now for corporates. So I think there's a lot we can do with that as a community. Right, so that was it. There's your basic overview of what I did. And I'm sure we've got some questions at this point.
Yeah, we do. And let me kick it off with one. So, Randall, thank you very much for giving an overview, and not just of the book, but all of the great work what you're currently doing and have done in the recent past. It's super impressive. And again, I encourage everybody to go on your webpage and pick the information you find the most interesting there. But all is worthwhile to be read and super interesting. So thanks again for that. I wanted to stick a little bit with your book. So when I read your book, I felt like the world is bad out there when it comes to corporate governance, and all the boards, many of the boards have issues there. And it's potentially, one could say, it's a slightly negative view of boards and the function that boards can have. And I wanted to ask you, like, what is your view overall on the status quo of board governance? So are all boards dysfunction, have one or two of those dysfunctions, or are many boards working quite well?
Well, there's quite a range out there from the other work and experience. I would say the average standard is okay. Probably good enough to avoid the worst of the disasters, but not the benefit to the organization that it really should be. Boards are operating, if we look back, say 20 years ago to where they are now, they've improved substantially, but there's a long way to go for them to be really, if you look at the really great boards, the ones that are really forward thinking, that really are setting strategy, you really are, helping the executive deliver, on all the things that it needs to deliver on. And there are not many of those. So yeah, of course, the book is negative because it's focused only on the disasters. So it's certainly not that bad. Just that it is kind of shocking how much of that stuff there is, how global it is. So it's not just, say, a European problem, an American problem, like this stuff, it goes everywhere. And the themes are more global than even we had initially anticipated. There's something about the way boards are structured and work. And there's a great article, I think Ruth was on at Academy of Management Annals a few years ago, Are Boards Designed to Fail? And I keep coming back to that paper because there's a part of me that says, God, I hope not. But maybe it's true.
Okay. So there was a question from Ruth as well. So if you could name one company where you think that's a pretty good board, so maybe even the favorite poster model board, is there any board that comes to your mind that you would say, well, this one is pretty nicely working well?
Yeah, I mean, having said what I said about, say, BP, and that's a company that has a lot of problems, right? They're on the wrong side of history, and carbon footprint, and climate change. They've actually been really helpful in leading the organization away from just pumping oil out of the ground and selling it, and into energy, and into things that are helpful, and more future focused, so that the organization will exist when we stop using oil. So I think even a company like that has has done a pretty decent job. And I would, despite a period in which they had a number of problems. Deepwater Horizon was the biggest and most notable, but there were a series of 3 accidents before that. That finally got the board really refocused, and they've done a good job.
Thanks so much. So there's a question also from the audience, and I'm putting you a little bit on a spot here now, but the question is, if you think about the board of Theranos or FDX, for example, where would you place them with regards to the 6 problems you have highlighted, the 6 board problems? So FDX, for example, or Theranos? They probably have multiple, right? But
yeah, I'm not sure I know them well enough to know.
Yeah.
Each of these cases, I go in and really find search for everything you can find, see if you can find somebody who's close to it or on the board in some way, to really make sure I've got it right. So I have to say I'm a little reluctant to say it because I don't really know it.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. No problem. So let me pose the second question that William asked. He asked about venture capitalists and angel investors, and is wondering if, in your opinion and in your experience, they're starting to take corporate governance more seriously with younger firms, right? Especially since we have seen a few of the younger firms that have blown up quite spectacularly. So is there a role for VCs and angel investors to push corporate governance to be better? And actually, are they doing it in your experience?
Is there a role for them? 100% yes. I'm doing I'm just starting I'm doing a boards program for startups in life sciences. And I've been interviewing people in the industry from all different angles, and absolutely the best ones start talking about corporate governance early. Start getting the advice to the CEO early. And the board will evolve, right? Because early boards tend to be more hands-on, more directly involved. And the board will evolve with the organization as it grows. But there's absolutely a role. They're starting to talk about it a lot more. I'm talking to VCs, I'm talking to in that industry, and they're talking about corporate governance now, about the importance of it, and getting it started early. And because in those industries, the problem is like the VCs will demand a place on a board, right? And the problem is that they're stuck with a board, which is investors, not people who have that kind of completely independent interest. So in their own defense, they should have an independent chair and a few independent directors who can, if at nothing else, help manage the VCs who are on the board.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much for that. That brings us a little bit to a question that was also asked from the audience here. So from JF about the separation of chairman and CEO, right? So CEO duality, it's pretty common still in the US. Do you see any role there? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it depend on any of the 6 problems, the dysfunctions you have highlighted, maybe?
Yeah, so it contributes to a lack of independence problem.
Yeah.
Typically challenge the CEO if there's a problem. So the way around it in the US has been to have a really strong senior independent director, a designated, understood person who can approach the CEO chair if there is a problem. That's the way around it. In general, there's a reason why the rest of the world has moved away from that. Right? It just makes it hard to avoid classic corporate governance problem of a principal agent problem.
Yeah.
And so, if you look at the rules, what about just over half the world uses the UK standard for corporate governance, regulations, and the US rules are really only the US for that reason, because I'm born and raised in the United States. I'm criticizing my own country here, but it's not great.
Yeah. And if you so your book is, at least in my understanding, applicable around the world, of course, to dysfunctions, but we know that there's certain differences in the institutions and the culture when you take the US and UK, but although when you go to other parts of the world. So for example, in Germany, right, there's the dual structure of a board, and the board is really has more of a function of controlling and monitoring. Is there any specific advice you could give to boards that have a, let's say, unusual structure like German boards, which are 2-tier boards?
Yeah, and I think this is where, when you get to the back of the book and you start looking at the questions we suggest, and they get at the psychology. I'm a psychologist, right? Dabbling in the world of the more macro, ideas out there, and I spent my whole career kind of running that border line. I bring a particular point of view, and culture and values and those kind of things. Structure can help them or hurt them, but they still exist. Have a different structure, you can still come back to those same psychological principles of, is there independence of the board enough? Are there missing voices in this process? Are voices that are just not being heard that are relevant? the larger stakeholder questions. So I think you can still ask most of the questions that we pose, regardless of the unusual or different structures that you find around the world. And you're absolutely right. The Nordics also have a somewhat different, couple of them have somewhat different structures as well. So yeah, I think for me, one of the strengths of the book is that I'm on the psychology rather than structural stuff.
And there's a closely related question, and you might have answered it already a little bit with the answer you've just given to my last question, but I still want to post it. So from Ryan asked, so especially for countries where investor protection is not very strong, like it is in the UK or in the US. So let's say emerging markets where we have a lot of, let's say, dominant ownership, maybe business groups, family ownership there. Do you see like potentially different problems coming up with regards to the 6 classifications you have seen there?
Great question. Not from what we've seen. They're remarkably consistent. And I guess that was one of our big surprises, because we specifically went out with the notion of saying, well, is this set of problems, say, an American problem, and this set of problems, a UK problem, and this set of problems, and we spent a lot of time trying to fit that lens. It didn't work, which to me says the psychology of the problem is the psychology of the problem. And yes, they will look a bit different in different places, but there'll be a degree of consistency that's really helpful. So at least go to that chapter on questions and get something useful no matter what your structure looks like.
So we're jumping back a little bit when I posted the earlier question about separation of the chairman and the CEO role. And you mentioned, so if there's no separation, then sometimes there's a very strong lead independent director, for example. And there's a question by Paula, who would love to know a little bit more what you think could be a positive role of a lead independent director to maybe help to address some of the board issues, especially in companies where we have CEO duality.
Yeah, so if you're going to deal with many of the problems that we talk about here, you need a good senior independent director who has the acknowledged power to directly challenge the CEO. Because unless there is such a thing, the CEO chair goes unchallenged entirely. Which, if you're the CEO chair, sounds like a lot of fun. But in practice means then, the company really does rely on one individual. And well, as a group scholar, the thing that everybody over and over and over is that groups outperform individuals on average. That's the whole point of why we have boards. Now, there are all kinds of challenges to that, which we've already talked about. But if that basic principle holds, then yeah, you need that senior independent director. They need to be acknowledged as the person who can challenge, so that if I'm an independent director and I have some issue with what's going on, I can go to that person and say, here's my concern. If I don't have that, then what happens is, the kind of thing that happened at, say, RBS, where there was a chair, but the CEO had such high status and was so aggressive that no one challenged at all. And there were big problems with that acquisition that anybody with a basic understanding of finance should have challenged. And yeah, I guess the thing is, you without that challenge, it just doesn't work. Governance doesn't work. So even if you can't get it through a chair, you should be able to get it this way. Sorry, I never answered the question or not, but
yeah, you did. And there's a closely related question that was just posed by Laurence. She's asking, or let me rephrase it a little bit. There's a big discussion about, if independent directors really can make a difference in the board. And she's asking, in your rich experience, If there's multiple independent directors, can they make a difference? Can they prevent some of the dysfunctions that you see from evolving? And right, you referred to before to Drew's work, where she asked, like, what can we expect from boards? Maybe not so much. There's other work that says, oh, maybe we shouldn't expect too much from independent directors. So in your experience, does it matter if you have several independent directors on a board? Can they prevent some of the dysfunctions you describe in your book?
Yes, they can. I guess the thing that the lesson that was in a 1950s, probably most of you have never heard of something called social decision schemes, was stuff done by Jim Davis back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And he set up a set of what are the decision rules in a group, and then what do the outcomes look like? And instead of theorizing all this interaction and dynamic stuff, which is nonsense, if you figure out the input, I can tell you the output. And one of his basic principles was truth alone never wins. Truth supported wins. Mm-hmm. So if it's one person in a group, the chances that the group will follow it or respond to it are pretty much nil. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, two people raise something, chances are the group will deal with it. Mm-hmm. Independent directors, the problem with independent directors is that most of them are former CEOs, CFOs, whatever, right? They're from the C-suite, and they're used to being evaluated individually, and they don't know how to be a team player. Mm-hmm. So they want to raise it and be the star instead of saying, you know what, this is bad for the organization, and I don't need my name on it. I just need other people to see it. So I'm going to work with people around me, in those side conversations, one-to-one, right? And make sure that other people are also raising it so that the board will pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. And they're bad at it. If I'm going to critique independent directors, that's the critique I'm going to make. They all want to be stars because many of them were star individual managers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that the transition from senior management onto a board is kind of straightforward and seamless. Mm-hmm. Completely different thing. And the failure rate going into the boardroom, if you look at a standard that I laid out in that one slide, there's a lot of independent directors who fail. Even though officially on a piece of paper, they've been there for 6 years or 9 years, but they don't know how to work as a board. Mm-hmm. And that's, I keep banging on about in this thing about, we do these board evaluations, but what we don't do is look at how we're working together. So when I do board evaluations, and I have, I'm asking each director, do you feel heard? If you ask them collectively, they'll all say yes. If you ask them individually, you get much more honest answer. Uh-huh. So why is it that 2 or 3 of the directors here feel like they're unheard in the boardroom? Mm-hmm. Let's have that conversation and see if that helps help you make better decisions. Mm-hmm. And chances are it will.
Mm-hmm. And one way one could interpret your answer was, maybe we shouldn't have as many former CEOs sitting on the board. Did I understand you correctly, or am I misinterpreting you on purpose?
Well, I think there's two lessons coming out of it. One, when we have former CEOs on the board, they need a little education somehow. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Not that we're going to be open to formal education of any type, but somehow, this is what a really good chair can take those people on and say, I know you think you're all that, but there's a lot to learn here. Mm-hmm. And if it's a respected chair, they can. So I've interviewed a few of those chairs. They start with a letter of appointment that's very, very specific and detailed. Here are all the things I need you to be doing. Mm-hmm. And they give them annual feedback, and they really focus on how to help them make that transition. So I think that's one part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is, if we want boards to be diverse at all, they cannot be former CEOs and CFOs. Right? I mean, and that's what that report on diversity is about. So some of the core findings there are that most of the women, right, because there's no women in those roles virtually, there are very few. So the women who are on the boards, and boards have gone from virtually, single digit numbers to, like 40% in, say, in the UK and the US, and actually much of the world in the last decade, though, virtually none of them were CEOs or CFOs, right? And they've had a positive impact. But what it means is they start off lower status because they don't come in as a former CEO. And the good boards put them in charge of committees to build the reputation within that board that allows them to have the influence that you would want them to have after, build that up over a couple of years. So yeah, if we want boards that are diverse, they can't all be CEOs and CFOs either. So I would agree with the second part, but I don't want to ignore the first part.
Very nice. Thank you for the answer. There's a question that's closely related, so let me pose it to you. Is there anything that you would say is a character or personality trait that makes a board member, in your experience, more effective or most effective? So anything related to individuals' character traits that are conducive to a good board culture and a functioning board?
Yeah, and I think the big one for me is openness. Which in practice oftentimes, people use words like curiosity, or interest in lots of different things. That, wanting to understand how things work and why they work that way is at the core of doing a decent job here. That is, if I'm going to identify one I think is particularly helpful, I think that one probably is what I would say. Again, in one of those other studies, the best predictor of how diverse a board is, and also how effective the board is as a diverse board, is actually the evaluation of the chair and how good of a listener the chair is. And I keep coming back to that finding and thinking, it's so simple, and yet obviously so powerful, that the chair needs to spend most of the time listening, not talking, and facilitating, a great conversation. And again, if you have a chair that wants to show off, you're highly unlikely to get a decent outcome here. And yet everybody wants their high status chair because somehow they think maybe that makes the organization look good, right? But the mistake is oftentimes you get a lack of curiosity and listening.
Thank you so much. Let me pose a question that goes a little bit away from the individual board director and personalities, more on a macro level here. So Eduardo is asking that maybe if I relate it back to the 6 dysfunctions of board you mentioned, is there a danger that if I solve one, I create the other? So for example, I increase board diversity and then the board becomes a bystander, or I increase independence and then the board becomes bureaucratic. So we're solving one problem, we're creating the next one. Is there a danger of that?
I think this, I think of it as keeping the board away from the guardrails or the bumpers, right? It's really easy to bounce off of one and go straight into another. So I agree with that. But this is where skill in leadership and awareness as an independent director helps boards avoid that. So not overcorrecting. But you're absolutely right. These are not, these 6 are, you'll find boards that have 2 of them or 3 of them at the same time. We've had to make judgments in the book about which one we think is the primary presenting problem, but there's a degree of other things going on as well. And you're absolutely right. Solving one, if you're not careful, and overcorrect. And this is where, I think that's right. I've been asked that question before. And it's a good one because some of these, because culture is fairly sticky, right? So it isn't like you just bounce from one into the next really easily. But to fix one and it's really sticky, you overshoot and end up in the other side. I think that's probably the best, way, a good way to think about it.
And it also relates very well to the discussion of board should be more independent or less independent, right? So if we overdo it, maybe we get the typical bureaucratic board. So there's value and balance, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, and I think that's the way both Jerry and I thought about it. Is there's value in a balance here, and it's not easy to keep a board in that high functioning space over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of these boards, even ones we name, right? This is a particularly, and so one of our contacts with BP, right, is kept feeling hurt that we were focusing only on Deepwater Horizon rather than other things that they've done and done well. And we're like, but the book is about bad decision making, so we're going to focus on that decision, right? So yeah, I in many cases, these boards essentially did something, if it's really bad, it can kill the organization, right? And probably about a third of the examples in the book are, or maybe a little bit more, are where the decision was so bad that the organization went with it. Mm-hmm. And in most cases, the organization does have an opportunity quickly to rebound and figure itself out. Mm-hmm. And that's what the BP board largely did after the Deepwater Horizons.
There's two questions. I'm going to summarize them in one because they're related. So the question is about boards in privately held firms, or, for example, private equity directors. And is there any lesson learned, for example, if you look at private equity director and private equity, how they usually operate, or public boards? So is there any lessons that we can learn from privately closely held firms or from firms that are owned by private equity investors for public firms in your experience?